Okay, so good afternoon. Welcome to this ACE webinar. I'm delighted to welcome you onto this, whether you're ACE members or you are members of the wider construction community, you're all very welcome. So I'm glad that you're going to join us for this. Now, this is one of the webinars in a series that we're doing called ACE Insights, looking at specific topics. So the purpose of this afternoon is to bring to life something which is quite complex, quite challenging, and hopefully give all of you a better understanding. We also have the opportunity this afternoon to ask questions. So if there is something that you are particularly struggling with, a particular challenge that you would like to raise in relation to IPR, please do make the most of the fantastic panel that I've got with me today. So we do a number of these. This most recently we've done one on the Construction Playbook, but today we're really focusing in on intellectual property. So again, quite a niche subject, but something that as a whole, whether you're a layperson like myself, so I'm going to excuse myself now for asking lots of daft questions and hopefully being able to follow the presentations, or whether you are a technical specialist, I hope this next hour has got enough for all of you within that. That's certainly how we have designed it. So as I say, I'm a layperson in this, so I'm going to sort of minimise my contribution to this webinar because we have got a fantastic panel for you. So I've got Ian Rodgers, who is the Head of Intellectual Property and Technology Law at Arup. Good afternoon, Ian. I've got Sheila Devine, who's the Commercial Lead for Growth and Skills at the Department for Transport. So the Department for Transport, I think, are doing some fantastic work trying to move this particular topic forward. So very excited to have Sheila on the panel to just showcase what the DFT are doing. Really brilliant that they're taking a leadership position in this. So very much looking forward to hearing from Sheila. So welcome. We've got Margo Day, Global Director of Risk and Commercial Law at Buro Happold, who's going to give a little bit of group counselling on sort of IPR challenges for consultants. So we can again get a perspective from that particular part of the market. And then last but not least at all, Alex Cunliffe, who's Head of Legal Contracts at Laing O'Rourke, and again gives us a slightly different perspective from the contractor, because I think what's really important when we tackle difficult subjects like this is to have that well-rounded view so that you aren't just locked into looking at it from your particular aspect, your particular angle. So again, fantastic panel. We are going to have a combination of perspectives and case studies. So we are actually going to have, some worked examples to make this a little bit more fun as far as possible as we go through the webinar this morning. And then, like I said, we're going to have some Q&A at the end. So if we could just move forward onto the housekeeping slide, I'll talk a little bit more about some of the process. So if those of you who've joined a number of these before, it's best if you listen through headphones. It will be far more enjoyable, but obviously if you don't have any, no problem. We will have the Q&A at the end, so you can take part in that by putting your questions into the chat panel, and I will be fielding those to the panelists towards the end of the webinar. And that can be on anything that comes up in the presentations. If there's a really sort of specific detailed point that you would like to raise with our panelists, don't be afraid to ask that. I will do my best to reiterate it to them in a concise way. But please do make the most of that. There is no such thing as a daft question on these, and you can put those in at any point. So if there's something that comes up on a presentation, pop it in the questions box. We will come back to it at the end. If we have too many questions, we will seek to follow up with you afterwards and sort of publish this webinar so you can play it back and share with your colleagues, but also look at putting some FAQs and things alongside it. The idea is we're doing this to create a resource for everybody. So we're going to kick off with a number of short presentations, about 7 or so minutes each. The first person up on the block is Ian Rodgers. So Ian, I believe you're going to give us some case studies, some good examples, as you're a particular expert in this area. So over to you, Ian.
Yes, thank you, Hannah, and hopefully the dog invasion that just happened won't happen again. I've shut the door now. So I'm head of intellectual property and technology law at Arup. I started life with an engineering degree, 4 years at Imperial College doing mechanical engineering, and went over to the dark side after that, requalified as a lawyer, and joined Arup in 1998. And I've been involved in things that have an intellectual property sort of strand to them throughout, really. But in particular, I set up our ventures business in 2013, where we take IP-based ideas and spin them out into new products and companies. So next slide, please. So I want to tell you a story. This is fictional, but it illustrates the point. So I want to introduce you to Shamira. Shamira is a senior engineer. She's very talented, and she works for an outfit called GHK Engineering Consultants Limited, and they are civil engineers. And they have had a sizable investment into digital, and in particular, they recognize that they really had to get ahead in the market. And so the profit share over the last few years is being heavily reduced because of the level of investment that they're putting into their tools. And Shamira came up with a really good tool. It deals with earthworks and in particular cut and fill operations. So making sure that your cut and fill are in balance. And this is something that she devised, and she went to GHK and got funding for. And the resulting tool is very impressive and has really been a key competitive advantage for GHK. So GHK are very excited to be able to tender for the UK's largest rail project. And the section of the railway project that they are bidding for goes from A to B, but the whole project goes from A to Z. And there is a contract that is tabled at the bid stage, and GHK send it to their insurance brokers, and they get a reply back to say that, there's one or two concerns on the liability side, but otherwise there's the insurance brokers don't raise anything. So GHK win that commission, and this tool that Shamira developed is put to great use on the project and in getting the earthwork design spot on. So she's pleased with that. Anyway, she attends an ACE webinar on intellectual property, and she learns about background intellectual property, and she figures that the tool that GHK funded is their background, and she learns about foreground intellectual property being the IP that's produced on the project, and she learns about assignment, where you hand something over and lose all rights to it, and she learns about a license, where one person gives another person permission to use the intellectual property. And so she goes back from that webinar, and she goes and has a look at the contract, and she looks up the clause that relates to background intellectual property. And she can't quite believe her eyes, because what the clause says is that by introducing this tool to the project, by using this tool on the project, the client has a license to use that tool across the whole project. So not just the A to B section where GHK are involved, but any section from C to Z throughout the whole project. And what's more, the contract gives the client the right to license the tool to any third party. And that includes GHK's competitors. So Shamira is absolutely gobsmacked by this, and goes back to carry on working on the project, and she can't quite believe the contract. Anyway, she figures that she can at least use this contract to further develop the tool. So she builds some extra modules. One is about time, the amount of time it takes to do the earthworks, and another module is about the cost associated with the earthworks. And these are implemented on the project. And she thinks, well, at least she'll be able to reuse these in future for all of her other clients. But again, she thinks maybe I better go and check that pesky contract. So she does. And what she finds is that the contract actually assigns those modules that she's created to the client, and that there is absolutely no right for GHK to use those in the future. They are now a stranded asset in terms of sitting in the client organization. So next slide, please. So this is these sorts of clauses we have seen on some of our major transport contracts. And just to put some questions, does this type of contract enhance innovation? Is this likely to stimulate innovation? Are contractors and consultants likely to come forward and bring their best innovations to the project? If the project is if the consultant is on a time basis fee, and these things make the consultant much, much quicker, where's the incentive to bring forward automation? And then we need to think about the human dimension. As consultants, we are recruiting digital people into our industry. They're coming in to work for the consultants to shape a better world, to see their work being used and not stuck in a client cul-de-sac. I've had those conversations, and these developers, they are very disappointed when that's what they find their work is happening to their work. The client might introduce an innovation KPI, which does that help? It just makes the contract more schizophrenic. And how negotiable are the contracts anyway? If Shamira had reviewed that contract and tried to tackle the procurement team, where would she have got to? Would they really have understood the issue? Or on the basis that they're not familiar with it, would the computer say no? So this is a tricky area, but it's quite clear that we have got to effect change, that we need innovation. We need contracts to stimulate innovation, to stimulate change. And it's clear that there are real challenges in the market with these contracts. But one thing that we can do is to not wait for the next project to come up and get into an argument at bid stage. We can get involved off project. And that was why I was really delighted when Hannah contacted me to get my views on where the problems lay, and then to use those to put across a point of view to DFT and see where it went. So so that was all I was going to say, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from Sheila.
Thank you very much, Ian, and that's brilliant. And like you say, really good sort of scene setter there on how something that you may assume even the insurance brokers may, overlook can really have such a significant impact. So, as you say, I think we're very fortunate in that we've been able to start to have these conversations and move this agenda forward. So I'm going to hand over to Sheila now, who has been working very hard in the DFT, I think, to put something forward which actually puts them at the forefront of clients in terms of their thinking and their advice out to the arm's length body. So I'm not going to steal your thunder, Sheila, but very excited to hear what you have to say.
Marvellous. Thanks very much, Hannah, and thank you, Ian. So, as Hannah said, I'm Sheila Devine. So I work for the Department for Transport in the commercial policy team, and I lead on growth and skills. So I'm part of the government commercial function, which is part of the Cabinet Office. I'm not a lawyer or an IP specialist. So like Hannah, I don't come to this with any particular specialism, but I'm a commercial professional looking to improve the way we procure and enable innovation. So that's how I've come into this particular topic. And I'm going to talk to you about the work we've been doing in DFT over the past year to try and reposition our approach to IP. So next slide, please. So first, I should say we've consulted really widely on this and actively sought feedback on the impact of our current strategies and how we can improve, including from members of this association. And I really want to thank everybody that's contributed and shared their stories, because this has really helped us move forward with this and actually understand the impact of some of our strategies. So this slide is intended to illustrate the balancing act we're trying to negotiate on IP, and it's not easy. So standard government contract terms tend to favour Crown ownership of new intellectual property. So that's intellectual property that's developed under the contract. And this is the default in many government contracts. This obviously, from our perspective, impacts on contract price if you as a supplier aren't getting a benefit from the wider commercialisation of your intellectual property, and also our ability to drive innovative outcomes. And that's where I've come into this, trying to improve our innovation. But we also need to make sure we can use the intellectual property too to maintain a competitive market and to share the outcomes for the greater good. Things like, if you think about things like modern methods of construction, standardization, and so on. And we've also sometimes have legal constraints around us, use of IP. For example, it's quite common for us to provide funding to foster innovation. And if we do that and then give unique use of the IP to a supplier, then we can potentially fall foul of state aid or subsidy rules. So we have to be a little bit cautious on that side of things as well. So on to the next slide, please. So with all this in mind, it became clear to us there's no real single contractual position we could move to that would resolve all these issues. We couldn't miraculously put a new clause in that would solve all these different angles we're trying to look at. So we need to look at what we're actually trying to achieve and the risks and opportunities around IP on a case-by-case basis. In short, we need to become better educated about IP and more informed about the consequences and the sort of behaviour we're trying to drive by our choices. So, you know, we need to change the culture really in DFT and get us thinking a bit more widely about the whole topic. Next slide. So what are we actually doing in DFT? We're actually moving to a more considered position to give the commercial teams the tools they need. So we're providing those teams with more options. At the moment, they have a single default position, Crown ownership, not so good. And we're actually giving them a number of new options. We're also providing new guidance on using those options, on using IP in different situations so that they can go into this with their eyes open, fully informed about the impact of the choices they make, the pros and cons and so on. We're also looking at accumulating a bank of case study examples, incredibly valuable to us. And we are implementing a capability programme. Next slide, please. So what are the new clauses? They can usefully be split into two categories, Crown ownership and supplier ownership. We are keeping our initial clause, the Crown ownership clause, the existing clause, because as I mentioned, there are cases where we do need to use that. But we're also looking at how we can improve on that position. We're looking to provide some balance to that Crown ownership clause and manage some of the cost and innovation risks by providing for a non-exclusive supplier license to use and exploit the IP. Now, recognise that isn't the optimal position for you as suppliers. Crown ownership you're able to license and use have some rights to use the IP, but recognising that we will be looking at closely, taking an eyes open approach to this and actually be surrounded by guidance that will help us understand the impact of this position. The other clause is supplier ownership clause, and this is looking at supplier ownership with Crown rights, either for the contract only or wider rights for usage. The fourth clause is supplier ownership with gain share. We don't really use this very much in DFT, but we want to retain the option to have that clause should we need to. Next slide, please. So when is Crown ownership likely to be appropriate? What is our guidance actually saying about Crown ownership? We think that DFT will probably want to go down the Crown ownership route for business critical projects, where we need to closely manage the intellectual property, where we want to retain use of it for a wider benefit, where we already own a lot of the existing IP. We don't want to create a grey and muddied position around IP ownership, where the IP services more than one contract, and where control of certain IP is in our interest, if there's a security risk, for example. So the key point to draw out here is that this was previously the default position in DFT, and we're moving to a position where we make a positive decision to retain Crown ownership. Will we use it? Is it on balance the best approach, given the negative impact it could have on our ability to drive innovation or on value for money? Understanding the responsibilities of ownership. Next slide, please. So when will Crown ownership be more appropriate? We are saying now in our guidance, and this is quite a big change for us, that Crown ownership should be the default position where there's no clear benefit in the Crown owning the IP. The key takeaway here is that if the Crown doesn't need ownership, then the best outcome for the wider economy is to leave ownership with the supplier who is best placed to use and exploit the IP. Next slide, please. So key message is we need to have better upfront conversations on IP. Our approach should be proportionate and risk-based, not based on the default position. Remembering that rights can be as important as ownership. Even if we have Crown ownership, there can still be supplier rights and vice versa. If we own it, will we use it? And we need to get much better at understanding the value of IP to each party. Often we simply don't understand. We go into these negotiations not really understanding the value, and it's really hard for us to have open conversations then. And also, you know, if we understand better the value, we can reach mutually beneficial positions. We tend to be in a bit of a sort of black and white situation sometimes, Crown or supplier ownership. There is a halfway house. You know, we might be able to reach a situation where we can drive a mutually beneficial position. Next slide, please. So what next? Our guidance is going to be launched soon in DFT. We're also working with the government commercial function, because what we want to do is not just have this position in DFT, but actually drive change across government. So we're trying to change the culture, and this can take a bit of time. So please bear in mind, this is a marathon, not a sprint, and be patient with us, but keep talking to us and giving us your feedback, because I think the key thing here is to have a bit of a better balanced discussion on this, a bit of a better upfront discussion on this, so that we can really start to turn the dial and make a difference. So I hope you'll see this as a positive step forward, and we look forward to working with you in future. And next slide, I think, is just any questions. But
I suggest to remind everybody, we can pop the questions into the Q&A box as well. So as you're going through, don't worry, they won't be lost. But no, thank you, Sheila. That was really interesting. And as I say, good to get the different perspectives, because it's very easy to sit on the market side and be quite sort of, you know, adversarial. Why on earth are they taking this position? Actually, I think you articulated really well the challenges from the client side, and actually the different things you are trying to balance that perhaps we're not always cited on as members of the market. So no, brilliant, and obviously hugely positive that DFT is moving forward with this more collaborative culture, developing the capability and the understanding and giving people options. So that, I think, is at the root of a lot of what we could be, you know, a lot of the challenges we face across all subjects really when it comes to commercial. So if we can do it for IP, there's hope for a lot of other things as well. But I think we'll pause there. I'm going to now bring Margo in to give a perspective from the consultant's point of view, and how you see IPR and the challenges and the opportunities there from consultants. So Margo, over to you.
Thanks, Hannah. Hi everyone, I'm Margo Day. I'm the Global Director for Risk and Commercial Law at Buro Happold, and I also have the pleasure of sitting on the ACE board and chairing the Legal and Commercial Group, which I've done for the past year. Next slide, please. I just wanted to start by giving an applause really to the DFT and also to Sheila for starting to address this issue, because this is an issue that has been, you know, prevalent for lots of us for a while in terms of what happens with ownership. I think what I'm going to do as I go through my presentation is just take you through some of the issues that we're seeing from a consultant perspective, and that has been fed back to us both from smaller members and also from the larger consultancy members. It's an industry-wide issue. Next slide, please. I just want to recap, you know, I thought Ian's highlight at the beginning in terms of his worked example of what IPR actually means was really helpful. But just to recap for the audience, you know, IPR is a legal term, and it's given the owner certain exclusive and non-exclusive rights to use or reuse the IP, meaning that nobody else can copy or use it without their permission. Now, background IPR, I think it's always easiest to think about it as, you know, IPR that's already been developed, that's in-house. And foreground IPR is what's developed on the job with the client. And it's clear that most clients go to consultants wanting to use their background knowledge, wanting to use that background IPR so that they can try and co-create something specific for their projects. Now, ownership of IPR, I've used this little cartoon to illustrate what can sometimes be the elephant in the room, whereby it's not always clear why people want ownership. You know, it springs to mind my children saying it's mine, it's mine. But I think there's a need for us to understand, why does a party need outright ownership of IPR? It's not the only option, and it is common in our industry to provide licenses for use, and licenses that involve the owner in the IPR giving another party, the licensee, permission to use its IP in exchange for payment or other returns. This has occurred quite commonly in our industry. I just think that more and more in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a need for there to be Crown ownership and also total ownership of IPR passing to clients. A recent example told by one of our members was there was a contract with I'll just say with a client, a public sector client, where the contract said that it assigned all existing and future IPR. So no foreground or background rights would remain with the consultant. As a result of this wording in the contract, many withdrew from the bid. And as I said, it would not be commercially advantageous for them to undertake in the bid and if they were successful to carry out the contract. I think the frustrations that were demonstrated by a few of the members was, despite explaining this to the council's in-house team, they did not understand how onerous and unnecessary that wording was. And it was perceived that there was a lack of understanding, which may have made the problem worse, but it kind of exacerbates that there needs to be an understanding on who needs to own the IPR and specifically why. Next slide, please. I think it's really to be encouraged, the early market engagement that Sheila spoke about, and this is something that's also been expressed in the Construction Playbook about sounding out in the market whether this is something that can work. In terms of taking a risk-based and proportionate approach, again, this is something that I think the consultants would encourage. Early engagement with the client for them to understand what would work best in terms of IP arrangements. Do we need to have rights and ownership in everything that's developed, or could we just have rights and ownership in some of the things? Could it be a license? Is there another way that we can actually try to address it? I think we need to consider that in a world where there's a need for standardization, commoditization, that we need a model that can actually be a bit more flexible and work with the changing world that we're all facing. But the value-based framework and trying to address how we engage in the industry from a values perspective rather than just from a monetary perspective or ownership perspective, I think is something that's playing out not just in the Construction Playbook, but in many of the ways that we're doing things. Next slide, please. So if there is to be a different way to approach an IPR ownership and licensing, again, it's reiterating that early collaboration, but also making sure that we don't create barriers to innovation. I think the example that was given earlier by Ian was really useful in demonstrating that the use of the model that GSK had provided across the whole of the project would have been really disadvantageous for them and not necessarily encourage innovation. And also, what does it mean for the entry of new suppliers to the market if we're not going to encourage innovation and just kind of look at IPR in a very siloed way? Supplier ownership as a default is something that Sheila espoused in her presentation. And again, that's to be encouraged. If that starts off as a default position, then it allows people to be able to speak about what is necessary. I think the gain share model is something that I've certainly seen more and more of, particularly when we consider the digitization that's going on across our industry. In terms of a gain share approach, if something is developed within a project, is it sensible that that foreground IP can be developed by the consultant, but that the client also is able to gain some financial benefit from it? I think particularly as the economic crisis, and I don't want to be doom and gloom, but what's projected in terms of the economy, there's going to be a need for clients to want to see how they can realize the value of something in the future. And this gain share model might be something that we start to see more and more. But we do have to consider how will we actually value that IP and what's the pricing that you'd actually put on it. That's something that I think is to be addressed in the future, and it may be something that you want to ask as a question later on. But it does come back to making sure that the contracts that we put in place are mutually beneficial to both parties and that it's clear what is exactly trying to be achieved. I think making sure that this is something that procurement teams are also tied into is also necessary so that they can understand the process that the client and the consultants and contractors want to achieve. Next slide, please. I touched upon it briefly before, but we talk about Construction 4.0 and that our industry is changing and the needs for consultants and contractors and clients to all be engaged in the same way. But I think there has been a tendency, particularly from a consultant's perspective, to accidentally give away IPR in terms of the things that they want to reuse, whether that's templates or coding. And I'm thinking about this particularly when we think about BIM. There could be inadvertent breaches of contract created because you assign copyright to the client, but you don't necessarily own copyright in some of the elements of the model, such as manufacturers' objects. And as we think about digital twins, there's a real drive towards digital twins, and we may need models data to be shared with others and used on a wider basis. That is much wider than just a specific project. And particularly thinking about the national digital twins, that is an agenda that is being driven forward at the moment. And therefore, I think we need to consider whether the clauses sufficiently cover everything that they need to. When we think about SaaS agreements and using software as a service, if you're granting an entitlement to lots of clients, then obviously you're not going to want to pass ownership across to anyone. And anything that you develop for one client, you'll want to try and invest back into your platform so that it can be for the benefit of more clients. I think the whole aim here is that we want to try and encourage innovation and not necessarily cut down on any one element or people coming forward with fresh new ideas. Next slide, please. So lastly, in conclusion, I just thought I'd put some things up on the screen that the ACE is driving at in terms of, net zero, no emissions, future of consultancy. And also there's just this need for us all to transform the built environment. I think that certainly trying to address IPR is one way that we can try to do it, because we're trying to encourage innovation, no disincentives to collaboration. It's great that we can see the public sector engaging with it. I guess the question is, how do we ensure that this can also be driven across the private sector so that we can achieve similar aims? And just a consideration that no one size fits all. We truly do need to get supply chain engagement, which should include SMEs, consultants, and contractors. But just to continue the message that Sheila said, let's just keep talking about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Margo. No, that's brilliant. Really interesting, again, sort of complementary insight from the who we know are very innovative as far as contractors go. So I'm sure we're going to have quite a forward-looking approach to IPR. So Alex, would you like to sort of take the reins?
Well, thanks, Hannah, and hello, everyone. My name's Alex Cunliffe. I'm the head of legal for contracts at Laing O'Rourke. And I guess, reiterating, I suppose, a lot of the themes that were already said. It's interesting how aligned we all are across the industry. There really is a need for a step change, and I'm hugely welcoming of the effort and the leadership that Sheila's showing with the DFT and looking at IPR differently. Fundamentally, we just have to break the cycle that we have at the moment. We've got to make construction a sustainable industry that attracts talent and really creates value. And I really do see innovation and fostering a culture of collaboration and ideas as absolutely fundamental to achieving that. Enablers, of course, are things like having fair returns and kind of certainty of those fair returns so that you can really invest in R&D. But in the context of what we're here to talk about today, sorry, the next slide, I should say. In the context of what we're here to talk about, IPR is absolutely fundamental in promoting that innovation agenda. The more that we perpetuate a culture of blocking ideas and silos and protectionism, we just risk the fate of the dinosaurs, essentially. We just can't carry on in this way. Other industries are moving apace. We really can and should. How is a young, bright person going to choose to come into this industry if they think they're going to be doing precisely the same thing as was done 50 years ago and will continue to do that? So it's incumbent on all of us to take that, make that step change. As Hannah says, I guess, I'm very happy to say that I work at a contractor that prides itself on innovation and is really driven to look continuously at how to do better and how to improve. One way that we're looking at it at the moment is an introduction of a design partner framework, which is very much focused on outcomes and the value that designers can bring, rather than a sort of a more myopic, if you like, focus on deliverables. And I really do, we want to kind of reset, I suppose, how we work with designers to encourage that collaborative approach and make sure that the real value that each participant in the industry can bring is actually brought to a project and a programme of works. I think really creating a culture of collaboration, and if we can do that and have that idea of sharing, really the possibilities are endless. I mean, taking a leap, just looking at COVID at the moment, you know, at least one pharmaceutical company specifically called out the fact that they've been sharing information with their competitors in a way that's never been done before as absolutely essential for their ability to develop a vaccine in months rather than years. It just shows that power of sharing. You know, indeed, obviously, COVID and Brexit more generally has created huge headwinds for our industry, but it really does create that opportunity, and that I think all of us as individuals and as an industry are kind of taking that step back and thinking, okay, now what do we learn from this? What do we now do differently? I've been involved with, you know, Hannah and others in the development of the Construction Playbook. And I find that a really exciting venture, because I think it gives a real opportunity to make that leap and to reset construction and set it on a really strong path in the future. I love the collaboration across industry. It's not about sort of one part of the industry beating the drum really loudly, protecting its interest to the exclusion of others. And I see that in the approach that's being taken by the DfT in the IPR strategy as well. See full alignment with that idea of the need to change and how to support that change. Of course, there are questions to be answered that we'll come across. You know, are contracts really going to have risk allocations that support that innovation? Are you going to have, on the one hand, the right IPR rights, but on the other hand, a very punishing fitness for purpose regime that means that you are definitely best down buttoning down the hatches and being really quite conservative? Will we continue to see those procurement approaches where you have say a Bravo portal, a kind of computer says no approach to procurement, which means you don't really get to engage in those value conversations that are so essential to the industry really being able to deliver its best? So, you know, it's easy to be cynical about these things, but I'm hopeful, and I think, you know, with people like Sheila and others showing that leadership, we are on the verge of a step change, and it's all incumbent on us to put the cynicism to one side and go at it. And that's it, really.
Brilliant, thank you, Alex. No, that's fantastic and great to see that enthusiasm as well. So I think, as you say, we're not short on energy and enthusiasm and reasons to do this and to get this right. Okay, so I'm going to open up to questions now. So do keep them coming in. I've got a few that have come through various people finding ingenious ways of getting them to me. So I've got a few different ones, but I'm going to kick off with one for yourself, Sheila, if we could. So the first question today, we'll start with an easy one, is, and I won't read names, I've been told I'm not allowed to read names. Like, obviously some people want to be anonymous, that's fine. So Sheila, the first one is to say that it's really positive and exciting, the developments from the DfT. But people are they're interested in how they can get feedback. So you've asked for feedback, examples, case studies. So Sheila, what's the best way for people to get those to you to make sure they do actually land with you so you can make the most of them?
Right, brilliant, great question, thank you. Yes, send them to me in the first instance, if you could, please. My contact details are in the slide pack. As I mentioned, we're in the process of pulling together guidance, quite detailed guidance for DfT commercial teams, and I'm starting to give some presentations on that across DfT over this coming month. But what we'd really like, what really brings it to life is real examples, and I think that has really made the difference for us in understanding the impact of our decisions on IP. So do send them to me. I will get in touch with you separately and see if there's anything more we can perhaps do to work together on this. We're even thinking about potentially recording some little sort of video clips and things so that our teams can actually hear directly from suppliers some of the issues and so on. So yes, send them to me, please.
Brilliant, thank you. So a very open offer there, as it should be, in a collaborative way. So thank you very much, Sheila. And just to flag as well, we'll continue to support through the legal and commercial group. So that is Margo's group within the ACE. I think we'll be picking up what we can do to support Sheila's team as they endeavour to change the culture across the DfT. Okay, so Ian, I've got a question that I think I'm going to put your way. So somebody is asking, what can we learn from other industries, from perhaps the technology industry, about IPR? How do they do it? What could we learn from them?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, one of the key areas is open source. Actually, there's a huge merits in open sourcing certain things. So Arup has got something that one of our staff created called Speckle, and you use this to translate between different design packages, and that is available open source. And there are merits in providing stuff open source. In other industries, aside from the open source thing, there are still battles over IP. But for example, Microsoft would never think about agreeing that the foreground IP that it creates in a contract with the client would be owned by the client. And as Margo mentioned, when you've got a software as a service offering, it's actually impossible for that to work if IP is assigned to the client. So I think if we look at tech industries, they're much hotter on this, and they're much sort of better off as a result. And actually, it's not like the clients are losing out because of that balance being shifted in the provider's direction. The providers are enhancing their products constantly because they're working with different clients, and everybody gets the benefit of the improvements that are made from the relationships with the other clients.
Okay, great. Thank you. No, that's really helpful, and it's just interesting, isn't it, to kind of take a peek across and see what they're doing. Okay, I have a question from somebody that's come in. I would say it's a slightly loaded question. So this one is for Margo and Alex around the somebody asking about how should or how could the IPR between consultants and contractors change in future? How does that dynamic work? We've talked a bit today, obviously, about the head client as a sort of DFT or one of the other government or private sector clients, but what about the relationship between the consultants and the contractors? I don't know who wants to go first. Oh, go on, Alex.
Either way, I think fundamentally the most important thing actually is around alignment. So it's no point having a consultant and contractor conversation if it's not also with the client and through the supply chain. It's a holistic piece. So I guess I would say that first of all, and then very broadly speaking, I mean, for my part, I think to Ian's point, actually, it's who's best placed to take and then use that IP and develop it and evolve it. And broadly speaking, you'd think that ownership should sit there with appropriate sharing rights, and quite open, broad sharing rights, I would say, because otherwise, again, taking that macro level picture, we fall back into our silos. And I mean, if I'm honest, I think about some law firms where there's a degree of protectionism around something that isn't really that innovative. And it's not really selling the value, and nobody went to kind of study, say, engineering to repeat the same drawing. They went to study engineering to do something really exciting, and so it's that part that should be focused on and kind of protected and share the rest.
So I could just say I agree, and that's the question answered. No. I think it goes to a point that you mentioned before. It's about collaborating truly, and I do think that often it is something that comes from the top-down client, so there does need to be that engagement across the whole supply chain. Equally, it's about being able to have the conversation about who's best placed to mine the data and for what purpose. I do think that over the years, you've certainly seen that as between contractors and consultants, a sensible discussion can be had about the IPR and whether ownership's needed or licenses can be granted instead, and just how broad does that need to be. I do think as we get more and more in terms of BIM and digital twins, it actually becomes a bit more difficult in terms of if we try and put ownership on it. It's a much better approach if we try and license it and think about different ways to use it. So it's a conversation that we need to continually keep having, as opposed to trying to look at it, like you say, in that siloed way. It's got to be something that's for the benefit and gain across the whole supply chain, because we all want to continue to be here to support each other in the future. And I think COVID's particularly emphasised that this year.
Mm-hmm. Okay, no, as you're saying, it is complex, and there are, you know, perhaps more options as we move through sort of digital transformation and different things that we should be thinking about. So yeah, it's a big learning curve for all of us. Okay, so Sheila, I've got another question for yourself. This one is a slight aside, so I think it's a question because you touched on government commercial function and your ability, if you like, to work across government, so that you, although you are in DFT, you actually have the network of government commercial function peers across the other departments. So someone's asked, how is government commercial function going to help scale this across the different government departments?
Thank you. Yes, we're working with government commercial function at the moment to standardise the IP clauses that we are looking to, we are introducing in DFT across what's called the mid-tier contract conditions. So this is the cross-Whitehall contract conditions, which currently also have Crown ownership as a default. So we are working with them to see which of these clauses they want to draw into the mid-tier conditions, having some very positive and proactive discussions there. And we're also looking at making our DFT guidance more widely available across the government commercial function. And we've made a good start with that already, because the Construction Playbook also draws on the messages from our IP guidance too. So yes, we're all about being joined up, and we'll do everything we can to share that more widely.
Okay, thank you. And a follow-up question, sorry Sheila, you again, was just somebody asking, you know, again, welcoming the guidance, but asking, you know, the Construction Playbook is very public facing, so, you know, it's up and everybody can read it and access it. Is the intention for the DFT IPR guidance to be there so that the suppliers can see it and try and understand it as well, or a version of it?
That's a really good question, actually, and it's something we need to think about. One of the things we are talking to the government commercial function about is whether they want to turn that guidance into government commercial function best practice, and quite what that means in terms of visibility, I'm not sure yet, but I don't really see any reason why we couldn't do something like that. I mean, certainly the content of it is, I mean, we've shared it quite widely in its development, and there's certainly nothing sort of top secret in it or anything. You know, we're quite happy to share those messages. It's just thinking about how practically we do that. So I think we need to factor that into our discussions. So that's a really good point. Thank you for that.
That's okay. No, I think that was a helpful question. I guess that's probably come from someone who perhaps works in client advisory, might be thinking that they, you know, don't want to be giving their client duff advice if you've got new guidance. So yeah, okay, I think that would be a really useful one. So another one for yourself, Ian. I've got a question around research and development. So maybe pre-contract, if you're sort of doing research and development, but doing that as a collaborative. So, you know, there's a few organisations perhaps coming together to create something. Could you sort of talk us through what you might need to think about in that space? So the person has given an example of I3P, which is one of the government and industry collaboration forums, but I guess it's a slightly broader question about what's your advice on dealing with that? Oh, I think you're on mute.
So at Arup, we have some standard collaboration agreement templates which we use, and there's a range of ways that IP can be dealt with, and flexibility is the key. And if it's a collaboration, then generally people will want to be able to use the fruits of the collaboration however they want. You can talk about having a joint ownership of IP. Alternatively, everybody can use what they create and give a license to the other parties to use that for non-commercial purposes, or you could extend that to have commercial purposes. The beauty of intellectual property law is that it's very flexible. I think the problem that we've seen to date is that people are thinking about it as binary in terms of ownership or not ownership, whereas actually you can use this licensing regime to create these win-win outcomes. So you can have what you want is the answer. I think the message is don't get stuck into IP. First, work out what each party wants to get out of the partnership, of the collaboration, and what they would want to do with the results, and then reverse engineer the IP arrangements onto that.
Very good advice. I think just in life, actually, that's very good advice, isn't it? You know, beyond IP, work out what everybody actually wants. You're going to have a much happier time trying to get everybody there. Okay, and you'll find out if you've got a problem very early. Right, okay, I've got one final question that I'm now going to perhaps put to Margo and Alex, is somebody asking about how IP should impact on your revenue and your pricing. So it's, again, maybe it's that slight build on what Ian was saying there, but does it have an impact on the rest of the contract? Perhaps you might like to both comment on that and how you would be advising internally some of your colleagues if they were querying some of that about how to price something.
I think it does have an impact on pricing. What value you put on it, I could lift my finger up in the air and try and ascertain it, because it comes back to the no one size fits all. I think it depends the extent to which you're proposing something innovative that you have developed in-house and how you want to utilize it in the future, what markets you see yourself taking it to, and a pricing structure that you think you'd like to put behind it. As part of future of consultancy, we're thinking about how we look at value-based propositions and value-based selling in the future. And if you want to be able to mine it in that way, you are going to have to come up with a different pricing structure that doesn't just tie in with a lump sum or a time and expense. And that's something I think our industry is grappling with at the moment, of what's the right way to do it. I've certainly seen when clients are looking to have a proposition, not necessarily in the UK, but in other markets globally, is to say that they'll take a percentage value. So if there's something that you develop together and that is licensed to both of you, that if you then utilize it with another party in the future, that a certain percentage will be paid back to the client. And that can be anything between 0 to 10%. And I guess it's thinking about, does that model actually work for you in your pricing structure now, but also in the future? And the difficulty that once it's out there, then others will also create the same thing. It's nothing that you're just capturing a moment in time of you've got something useful. Someone will come up with something in the future. And I think if you go back to the point that Ian was trying to encourage innovation in the UK, and there's lots of models that are set up that are encouraging this joint collaboration so that everyone can actually come up with a solution and mine it together. And I think we just need to think about how we can apply that across the industry. We've got our own kind of internal, we've got something called the BOM, which is our own open source data. That's been in place for years, and that's really good for other people to be able to utilize. But equally, there's stuff that you only want to utilize internally. And I think people just need to think about, what do they actually need? Because I think Ian's already demonstrated there's stuff that you can make more widely available, as opposed to just looking at it in a, it's all mine and I don't want anyone else playing with my toys way.
I guess it's my turn to say I agree with what she said. So yeah, I think it always is a quite nuanced and fact specific. I think that's one of the things that keeps coming through this kind of discussion, really, is that there's some general principles, but actually it's always about looking at it in a context specific way. I mean, I think, in terms of where the industry is at the moment, which is sort of in the foothills, if you like, of IP kind of complexity, it has tended to be quite a binary. Is it yours? Is it mine? And if it's not yours, you can't use it, kind of a conversation. I think, in practical terms, most of our energy doesn't really go on pricing changes around a bid to do with IP allocation. It goes actually around making sure you have the right rights and the right ability to continue to use. And I'm sure that will develop as time goes on, and as we all do start to become more like the tech industry than we are perhaps at the moment.
Brilliant. Okay, no, thank you. And actually, so we've just come to the end of our time now. So brilliant session today. Lots of people saying, well, another one just popped up then on my screen, distracted me slightly, saying, great. Great session. Will it be available? So yes, our intention is to record this, so we will circulate it. We will also pop it up on the ACE website so that people can watch it back and share it with their colleagues. So just to say thank you very much to all of my panelists today. It's been brilliant. I shouldn't say this to be rude, but it's been far more interesting than I had perhaps thought as a sort of IPR novice. I've learned a lot, but it's been very interesting on the way through. So really appreciate you taking the time to share that and to bring it to life, actually, something which could have been quite a dry subject. So to sum up, I mean, the takeaway points as far as I'm concerned, I think, the first one is there are wider implications beyond the contract. So don't leave this to a contractual discussion. Back to Ian's point about thinking about what you actually want out of this. Start the conversations early. It does impact on payment and return. So be aware of that. And actually, it's not just one clause in a contract. It's part of the overall ethos. We are becoming increasingly, or need to become increasingly sophisticated in our approach to IPR and contracts more generally as we transform ourselves digitally. So this isn't going to be the last time that you hear about this. And lastly, just to say, there are options. It's not a binary solution. I thought, Sheila, you set out really well that actually what we need to do is become better aware of the different options and try and work collaboratively to select the right ones. So that's my kind of main learning points, mainly for myself. That was really useful. Thank you very much, everybody. Just to sort of do a nod to some of our upcoming webinars, we have got one, I think, in the Northwest. Thank you, Chetna. Just popping me back on that slide about Project Speed coming up fairly soon, which I think will be really interesting. We're doing some stuff that you'll see in the next couple of weeks, which sort of builds on the conversations today around Project Speed. We've partnered with Laing O'Rourke again on that. Not that we have favourites for the contractors, but we did find that we were able to work well with them on that. And then lastly, just to say, we are going to be doing more of these types of events aimed at helping people to, learn a little bit more in bite-sized chunks about different subjects. So I think we are going to be tackling pricing models, value-based pricing, for consultants and for clients going forward. Those are two topics we've got on the agenda, so watch out for those if you've enjoyed today's webinar, and hopefully we shall see you back here soon. So thanks again, everybody, for taking part, your questions, and once again to my speakers for such really informative and accessible presentations on IPR. Thanks again all. Take care. Bye.